Hello, my name is Christopher Armstrong. I'm with the Homeland Security course Disaster and Response Recovery from Idaho State University, and I'm here to present the recovery operations case study from the 2018 Camp Fire in Paradise, California. Um, we are here with our local town officials from the town of Paradise, as well as many of our elected officials from the County Board of Supervisors from Butte County, as well as Butte County officials. Um, so go ahead and start here. This picture, my agency was actually one of the first agencies that responded into the fire. Upon our arrival, our resources were deployed directly into the town of Paradise. So we're going to talk a little bit about the event that led to the recovery. So the Camp Fire was the name of the fire. It was started by some electrical equipment belonging to Pacific Gas and Electric Company, which is the electrical provider for much of Northern California. In an area known as Polga, it's impacted by Jarbo Gap, and some extremely high winds are very common in this area. The fire was named the Camp Fire. It started in the morning hours of November 8th, 2018, and quickly became one of the deadliest and most destructive wildfires in California history. Unfortunately, 85 people lost their lives during this. Many of them were either unable to get out of their homes or died along the evacuation routes, both very tragic outcomes. There was a significant loss of structures in the area. This particular area is very prone to fire. It's had several fires throughout at least the course of my career, and is very highly populated. So a number of people lived up on it. It's often referred to as the Ridge, the town of Paradise. It's located just east of the town of Chico, which has a university in it. So the total structure loss was 18,804 homes. And really, when we look at the acres burned here of 153,336, that's a pretty small acreage loss, really, when you look at what California's faced here over the last 10 years. But again, due to the dense population, the high structure loading in the area, and the fire impacting the community, that's where we see these numbers. The goal of this presentation is to show how recovery has occurred, what things worked in the recovery process, where we've identified some gaps, and what leaders should plan for next. So it's important to kind of cover the disaster declaration process. And we'll see here that probably one of the biggest lessons learned was that early declaration tends to equal a faster response flow, an improved recovery process. That's all important to have in that recovery planning, actually, so that you're anticipating it in the future. Once you do that, you've enabled the individuals impacted by the incident to gain assistance. You're getting public assistance and hazard mitigation funding. So you'll see on November 12th, 2018, that a FEMA major disaster declaration was issued, and you'll see it was FEMA 4407-DR-CA. So the next thing we're going to do is kind of go through our RSFs and identify each one, talk a little bit about each one, and discuss what were some challenges, what were the recoveries, and what was our assessment. So the first one's going to look at our infrastructure. It was one of the most highly impacted things from this fire. And we can see that 95% of the utilities, the water, the power, and the broadband were destroyed as a result of the fire. And when we look at some of this stuff, we see the water supply was contaminated with a chemical known as benzene, which is toxic to humans. We also know that almost all of the pipe that was underground was melted and or destroyed and needed to be replaced prior to repopulation and rebuilding being able to occur within the community. The community was left without a functional electrical grid. All of the power poles were destroyed. The lines were down. And that also impacted the landline communications because AT&T is one of the providers in this area. They relied on the PG&E poles that were all destroyed. So that impacted things. And one of the other big lessons I think we learned in the response portion of it that went on into the recovery process is that we had limited communications, and that was because you lost power in the area. So even the cell towers were being impacted. Cell towers still rely on landline cables and fiber optic lines for communication. So having those limited communications made evacuation difficult for a lot of people, and then the recovery was slow because it was hard to get information in and out of the area. And finally, evacuation corridors were highly impacted by the fire. They were insufficient in size and ultimately, unfortunately, contributed to the loss of life. A lot of the responders, a lot of the fatalities occurred in people who were trying to actually exit the area and were found to have been deceased inside their vehicles. So what does the recovery look like so far? We've had a full water system replacement of over 100 miles of pipe relayed in the ground. PG&E has changed their electricity delivery method from overhead lines to undergrounding. It's a slow process. It's an expensive process, but it's a process, especially in an area that has such a high fire history and a high fire risk, that by undergrounding the lines, and we're hoping that we reduce in the future the ignition sources. And then along with that, PG&E's done a lot more microgridding work where they faced designing grids that were much smaller so they could impact fewer and fewer people in power shutoffs for safety purposes when an area is impacted by winds. I think one of the exciting things that we see here is a broadband feasibility study expanding fiber to support the economic recovery. We'll talk about that a lot more. As I indicated, I'm very familiar with this area. In fact, I lived up in this area back in the late 90s, and one of the big challenges up there has always been the lack of available internet. So doing this is going to be huge for the support of the economic recovery. And then finally, to address the issues with the evacuation corridors, there was a number of fuel break road projects designed to improve or reduce the impacts of vegetation on the roads, giving drivers a wider area that they could drive through so fire, if it does come through the area again, doesn't impact their vehicles right away. That was part of the street hardening process. And then finally, hazardous tree removal. And again, I alluded to it. A lot of people were found deceased inside their vehicles, and they became trapped at that point when trees fell or power lines came down. With PG&E undergrounding all of their utilities now, and the removal of the hazard trees, the hope is that evacuations will be more smooth in the future. As we know, fire is going to continue to impact areas within California that are like this. Our number 2 is the community planning and capacity in building. So when we look at this, in this particular case, there was no pre-disaster recovery annex, which resulted in delayed coordination and ultimately a delay in getting people the resources that they needed. We had limited permitting staff, which overwhelmed the operations. So when we look at some of the successes that we have now on the backside of the recovery, we see that there was a Recovery and Resilience Office created. There was a Rebuild Paradise Foundation formed. And we had updated home hardening, building codes, which will help reduce the building-to-building fire spread, hopefully keeping fires much smaller in this area. And then finally, both for the county and the state, we see a GIS risk mapping, and we're trying to use technology to better identify areas that are more prone. Some of this stuff gets shared with companies, or they have their own, like PG&E, so we can go and do that. But I think when we look at this here, this community planning and capacity building is going to be a long-term recovery process that looks at the vision. They identified building a safer community, a more welcoming community, something that's a stronger community, better than what it was before, and ultimately greener, something that is going to be less prone to a dependency on resources. Um, what was really unique about this, as we looked at it, we saw that approximately 6,500 residents actually provided inputs through town hall meetings and planning things. We had a bunch of WUI code, which WUI stands for Wildland Urban Interface Code modernizations, which happened across the state of California actually. And a lot of this recovery was provided, the guidance was provided through a collaborative effort of FEMA, Cali OES, and advocacy teams. So when we look at the overall success of this part of it, we see a strong process in place. However, it's important to identify that risk will return, if not grow, if there is a change in leadership focus or funding turnover. So it's important that we continue to keep this as part of our focus. Housing recovery was another one I mentioned. Utilities was huge. Housing was another one. Approximately 90% of the homes were lost during this incident here. So it displaced a significant number of residents. In fact, most of the residents up on the ridge were displaced. And as a result, prior to the incident, there was very limited affordable housing, but after the incident, there was even less. What's unique about Paradise is that it's a little smaller town just outside of the city of Chico, where a large workforce is employed, and a lot of people that worked in Chico lived in Paradise. It was more affordable at the time, but with the fire, that impacted another community there. So very limited affordable housing and rebuilding options at the time. Debris removal took over a year, and that further delayed the rebuilding process. Debris removal impacted communities outside of Paradise. As I mentioned, Paradise is up on the ridge. The Skyway is the main way out. Takes all those trucks that were removing that debris to hazardous waste treatment sites, had to go through Chico. They had to go through towns like Marysville and Oroville and Yuba City, and down into Sacramento. So a number of other infrastructures were impacted that we didn't discuss outside of the immediate fire and disaster area. And then finally, California has really struggled. It's been well documented with insurance problems. What we saw in this particular situation is insurance delays. You had insurance companies that had significant exposure up there. They ended up ultimately having to file bankruptcy and not able to pay out, which led many residents to have to revert to the FAIR plan, which is the state's insurer of last resort. That created delays. The cost of debris removal was significant and also created delays. And then obviously the temporary housing, or the shortage of temporary housing, really impacted the overall situation and the human impact of where these people live. So a lot of residents ended up leaving the area. Some of the positive recovery outcomes that we saw is the permit process was streamlined. Housing grants were awarded. The community, both the county and the town, really expanded their ability and that of the residents to build ADUs, or accessory dwelling units, smaller units that would allow for maybe a homeowner to have a home, but also build something a little bit smaller that could rent, increasing the available affordable housing for people that maybe couldn't afford to buy or live up there. Also an expansion in manufacturing, the use of manufactured homes was approved, and that expedited that rebuilding process, because many of those were built off-site, trucked in, and put in, and allowed people to rebuild back a little bit quicker. By the year 2022, we saw over 2,400 homes that had been rebuilt. But when we look at the population, we're going to talk about this a lot in the economic, which is the next slide. But the population is still, even today in 2025, is far below the levels that we saw the day prior to the fire. So, in conclusion to the housing and recovery, the RSF number 3, we see a rebuild rate that continues to improve. However, the affordability gap remains very high for a lot of survivors. And again, we constantly hear stories of people either being unable to build or just walking away because of those high costs. So still some room for improvement there. Number 4, our economic recovery. When we take a look at here, almost all the businesses that were up on the ridge were lost, over 3,000 businesses, which resulted in a tax revenue collapse. And this had an impact. This impacted fire protection services, it impacted law enforcement, it impacted the town's general services, their finance departments. All the things that you really need to have a community were significantly impacted. This also resulted in high unemployment. You no longer had the businesses up on the ridge, but you also saw an increase in unemployment in the Chico area and the Butte County area as a whole, because as I mentioned, many people lived up on the ridge and commuted out to other businesses. We saw high insurance costs. This was a big takeoff for where we saw insurance companies leaving the state and leaving many homeowners to only have either out-of-country insurance access or through the California Fair Plan. So you saw homeowners insurances that tripled, quadrupled, went up 10 times in some instances. So the high insurance cost has had a significant impact. Also on that rebuilding, if it's too expensive to rebuild or too expensive to insure once it's rebuilt, a lot of people are unable to do that rebuild. And then finally, we've had a lack of commercial property, so it's hard to rebuild that tax base, or it's been slow to rebuild that tax base and get people to come back up there because of the services, because there's not the commercial properties. An example of things that we know burned: you had the small mom and pop stores, you had the downtown stuff that were destroyed, but you also lost grocery stores, you lost gas stations, you lost fast food establishments, you lost restaurants. So a lot of the things that were needed for day-to-day life unfortunately were lost. So what have we done progress-wise? Well, federal advocacy platforms leveraged funding to hopefully get people back up in there, get them rebuilding. There's local business microgrants, SBA support, and that's all good. But again, one of the things that's really kind of kept a cap on their economic recovery really has been the high cost of insurance and people's inabilities to rebuild, or just in general the slow rebuilding process. One of the things I'm most excited about, I think, is the broadband development plan. It was prioritized for future growth. I think one of the keys to attracting businesses back to a community is having that fast access to internet and technology services. And so as the community builds out, bringing that product up off of the valley floor is going to be important. And I think you're going to see a significant rebuilding process take once they have access to those types of services. RSF number 5 is our health and social services. And this was interesting. The hospital primarily suffered significant damage, and some of the buildings on the hospital grounds were completely destroyed. But you also lost clinics. We don't think of schools when we think of health and social services, but schools were important because you lost a lot of schools, and you had a decrease in population. So a lot of the schools had to close down, and the schools, to me, really kind of apply into the social services side of things. And then one of the big things that we've seen is the long-term PTSD and trauma among the survivors, but also the first responders. A lot of the first responders saw a lot of things that they'll never forget in their life. A lot of frustration not being able to get in and save people because the fire just impacted the town so quickly. But the long term PTSD overall and the trauma is something that is great. People really have a fear of fire. There's some real anxieties and struggles that people are still experiencing and dealing with today. So those recovery actions that we've been able to do is acquire grants for crisis counseling and behavioral health. Slowly been working on the reopening of clinics and educational facilities. Obviously, that's going to be driven by the repopulation, which goes back to the housing. Survivor support hubs with centralized services, and then also mobile health services. This is a community that has some very rural components of it. Magalia was impacted. You don't often hear about it, but it was a smaller community, very rural, a lot of gravel roads to get to them. Concal's another one. So having access, a lot of those people may not be able to drive, or it may not be feasible for them to get in. So having access to mobile health services that will also aid in PTSD treatment has been a big thing. So when we look at it, the social recovery aspect of things still remains to be one of the slowest. The major need for pre-disaster mental health planning is where this exists. And to be honest with you, knowing the area and understanding Northern California, prior to this incident, there was a need there for mental health support, and it just wasn't there. So this fire it hasn't necessarily made a new problem, but it's taken an old problem and made it significantly worse. So it's one of our slowest recoveries that we're seeing. Finally, our number 6 is natural and cultural resources. So the environmental damage that we saw here was significant burned forest and watershed, which resulted in instability, increased debris flows, risk downstream, a significant loss of or damage to wildlife habitat. So not only were the humans displaced, but much of the wildlife was also impacted. And wildlife on land and in water. The Feather River is a major waterway within Northern California that feeds into Lake Oroville, which is one of the largest lakes in California. But you also have the water habitat that was lost and impacted. So fish and things along those lines. And then finally, a loss of landmarks and cultural spaces. This area was very rich in that. A lot of California gold rush history, Indian burial grounds, and just Indian land in general. So a lot of landmarks and cultural spaces that were important to different cultures were all impacted by it. Recovery measures, we've seen a prolific stormwater resilience project, which really focused a lot on erosion control, trying to keep some of those toxic materials from the structures that burned out of the water system, mulching to try and stabilize soil, and kind of monitoring a sediment, how much of it was making it down into the Feather River. There's been a big effort to restore the Feather River watershed. I think it's important to look at that because California as a whole, as a state as a whole, really depends on this Feather River watershed. Southern California doesn't get a lot of rain. Northern California gets a lot of it. And a large percentage of the Feather River watershed has been impacted not only by this fire, but a number of fires here in the last 10 years. And that watershed, when you lose the tree cover, you lose the shade, the snow doesn't stay as long. And we know that the snow and ice that comes in the wintertime up in these areas acts as a frozen reservoir that saves that water. All that water, as I mentioned, makes its way down through the Feather River itself and into Lake Oroville, one of the largest lakes here in California, and is a major contributor not only to our drinking water but to our agricultural water that produces our food. So the statewide impact from a financial aspect in farming and agriculture were also impacted. Another one is we went back and we looked specifically, CAL FIRE did, at its defensible space policy. It's been refined. We see some stuff coming out now that we call Zone 0. as opposed to what we were using before, which was our 30-foot space and our 100-foot space, which was not only hard to acquire, especially in neighborhoods, but was very expensive. This new Zone Zero and structure hardening, we hope will have a much more significant impact on what we're looking at. And then we continue to see the rebuilding of some historical memorials and cultural documentation, and trying to gather up those significant artifacts so that everything's not completely lost. Let's take a look here at the preparedness before the fire. As I mentioned, this area has a high fire incidence. I personally have responded to fires here, and the Camp Fire being the third large one in my career. But the problem was that we knew there was a high risk, but unfortunately, due to funding, due to many other factors, some risk reduction was done, but it was obviously insufficient. And we can go back and we can look at that again. We talked about the limited evacuation capacity planning, the lack of a recovery plan or recovery annex, high fuel density, California's drought, aging infrastructure. All those things combined to result in what ultimately became a large loss of human displacement and human life, and made it way worse than it would have been had we done a better job in planning for it. So when we look at some of my recommended mitigation strategies, we'll see here we're going to look at some priority actions. We need to expand vegetation management through the use of controlled burns. It's going to have the greatest impact in the most rapid amount of time. And we need to expand that's on there twice, but expand vegetation management and control burns. This is ultimately going to reduce fuel loading and ignition intensity, also ignition probability. So it's important that we look at that. Next, using hardening of all of our reconstruction materials, whether it's the use of Class A roofs, which are less flammable, less opportunity for the home to catch fire. We could talk about the use of fire-safe vents. It's going to be a smaller venting. Some are designed to close up in the event of a fire or heat. Defensible space. One of the things I didn't put on there is fire-resistive building materials, sidings, things like that. Keeping landscaping away from our home. So all of that is going to have a significant impact, and what we're trying to do is reduce or prevent the structure-to-structure fire spread that we saw during this incident. Permanent recovery annex inside of the EOP, which is going to ensure some staffing and coordination begins immediately. We don't have that delayed response. Broadband, adding redundancy and microgridding. And what we're shooting here for is a prevention of a total loss of communications or a communication collapse. And finally, long-term behavioral health funding. Again, that goes back to the human impacts and trying to ensure that we take care of the people. It's important to understand with this incident here, the recovery is going to last for years. We've already seen that. I believe this is our 7-year anniversary. And that recovery is still going. We haven't even rebuilt. We haven't hit that population, pre-fire population. But again, we've talked about it. The fear that people have when they see a wisp of smoke come up in this area, it's significant. It's real. It has a real impact on people, and so it's going to need continual funding to ensure recovery. So as we wrap things up here today, we can take a look at the Camp Fire, and we can see that this incident has proved that recovery is possible. It's been slow, especially without the prior planning, adequate planning. I think they had some planning, but it wasn't adequate to what the area really needed. And it was going to require local governments to plan that recovery before the disaster occurs. When you do that, you're going to be able to rebuild faster. You're going to reduce the number of residents that are displaced. You're going to be able to protect infrastructure and the economy. You're going to save lives. You're going to have less fatalities. and you're going to spend less in the long term. It's a big financial commitment today, but in the long term, we're not going to be rebuilding entire infrastructure systems. You're not going to be rebuilding entire communities. You're not going to be dealing with the long-term healthcare cost of the trauma that has been imposed on the people that experience this. So mitigation and preparedness today will determine the survivability tomorrow. And wrapping things up here, we're going to talk about the top 3 successes. We had a strong community-driven long-term recovery planning process that took place here in Paradise. A very forward-thinking infrastructure with modernization of sewer, utilities, and broadband. We've developed and implemented a WUI code, again, a wildland urban interface code, and mitigation enhancements, improving future fire resiliency, in hopes that you're not rebuilding that whole community. We still have 3 areas for improvement: affordable housing, then the rebuilding place, and the displacement hardship. Really need to work on improving that. Behavioral health capacity was insufficient before the fire, as I mentioned, and obviously has continued to be insufficient after. And then the economic regrowth has been slow, without access to an adequate workforce and housing, and a number of other utilities and things like that. So still some areas to go, but overall I think a very successful process here 7 years out. I appreciate you joining me here this evening, and I hope you've learned something from this.